Idaho, 1997. A cold case that haunted a quiet town for over 2 decades has finally been solved. Daniel Reese was just 25 years old, gifted auto mechanic known for restoring classic pickups and helping his elderly neighbors without asking for anything in return. One October evening, Daniel never came home. His truck was found idling near the Snake River, tools in the back, the driver's door ajar, and no sign of a struggle. Or of Daniel. The investigation ran into brick walls, rumors, dead ends, whispers of police oversight, and then nothing, for years. But in 2023, a DNA match from a routine database entry would send shockwaves through the very heart of the community. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the autumn of 1997, Garden City, Idaho was a place where life moved slowly. Tucked just outside Boise, the town was known for its long stretches of farmland, its small diners that closed before midnight, and its people, hardworking, tight-knit, and proud. Among them was Daniel Reese, a 25-year-old auto mechanic whose life seemed ordinary on the surface, but whose story would come to haunt the region for decades. Daniel worked at Redline Automotive, a modest repair shop just off the main highway. Grease-stained hands, denim overalls, and a smile that could ease any frustrated customer. He was the kind of mechanic who never upsold or exaggerated the work. Regulars said he treated every car as if it belonged to family. He'd start his mornings before sunrise, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug and listening to old country tunes on the radio while the rest of the town still slept. At home, he lived with his younger sister Emily in a modest 2-bedroom house their parents had bought years before. The Reeses had endured tragedy early on, losing both parents in a car accident when Daniel was still a teenager. That loss forged an unbreakable bond between the siblings. Daniel took on the role of protector, working odd jobs until he could afford to keep them both afloat. By 1997, he'd built a simple, honest life defined by loyalty, responsibility, and love for family. Neighbors described him as the kind of man you called when you didn't know who else to call. When Mrs. Langley's furnace broke one winter, Daniel fixed it before the technician even arrived. When a stray dog wandered into his garage, he adopted it and named it Clutch. His kindness wasn't loud, it was quiet, consistent, and genuine. That was Daniel's way. He wasn't much for nightlife. Most evenings, he'd be found beneath the fluorescent lights of his garage, working on his prized project, a 1968 Ford F-100 he hoped to restore to factory perfection. The few close friends he had often joked that Daniel's idea of fun was a cup of diner coffee and a new carburetor. He was content that way. Still, there were moments when he seemed lost in thought, gazing out at the Idaho horizon as if burdened by something unseen. Emily noticed it once in a while, a kind of quiet heaviness in her brother's eyes. But whenever she asked, Daniel would just smile and say, "Just thinking about the next job. That's all." In a town where gossip traveled faster than the mail, Daniel's reputation was spotless. He had no known enemies, no debts, no grudges. Police would later confirm that his record was clean. No arrests, no trouble, not even a speeding ticket. But as detectives would learn years later, the appearance of peace often hides the smallest cracks that widen over time, letting darkness slip through. Those who knew him never imagined Daniel could simply vanish. Yet in October of that year, his life, so rooted in routine and reliability, would take a turn that shattered every sense of safety Garden City once knew. 1 week before his disappearance, Daniel mentioned a customer he wasn't comfortable with, a man who'd shown up late to the garage, asking questions that didn't make sense about old engines and cash-only repairs. Emily brushed it off at the time. Now looking back, she'd wonder if that conversation was a warning sign they all missed. For 25 years, Daniel Reese's name would echo in Idaho's cold case files as one of the state's most haunting mysteries. But in 1997, he was just a young mechanic living an honest life, unaware that his final days were already unfolding. What happened that pulled Daniel from his peaceful life? And who was watching him? October 17, 1997 began like any other for Daniel Reese. The air in Boise, Idaho was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as a soft breeze moved through town. Daniel arrived at Redline Automotive just before 8 a.m., clutching a thermos of stale gas station coffee and a tattered clipboard. He greeted his coworkers with a half smile, the kind of smile that hinted at routine more than joy. It was a typical Friday, and no one suspected it would be his last. He spent the day rotating tires, replacing brake pads, and tuning a carburetor on a '78 Chevy Impala. Around 5:30 p.m., he clocked out, punched his time card with a mechanical clunk, just like always. Before heading out, he mentioned he had one last errand, a house call to help an older client whose truck had broken down just outside of town. He loaded his toolbox into the back of his faded green Chevy pickup, gave a casual wave to the guys in the shop, and pulled out of the lot. That was the last time anyone saw Daniel Reese alive. When Daniel hadn't returned by 9 p.m., his sister Emily began to worry. She paged him once, then twice. No reply. That wasn't like him. Daniel was many things, but inconsiderate wasn't one of them. By 10 p.m., her anxiety gave way to dread. She threw on a hoodie and jeans and began retracing what she assumed was his route, west along the rural edge of Garden City, where pine trees pressed against the narrowing roads and headlights barely pierced the dark. Then, just before midnight, she found it. Daniel's truck sat parked by a bend in the road near the Snake River. The headlights were still on, casting a dull, eerie glow into the woods. The engine was idling, low and steady. The driver's door was ajar, toolbox undisturbed in the bed. Emily stepped closer, calling out her brother's name. Nothing. The night air was cold and silent, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the low hum of the truck's engine. Daniel was gone. She called 911. Deputies arrived within the hour and cordoned off the area. They searched the woods with flashlights and dogs, but the terrain was difficult, covered in uneven rocks and thickets. The riverbank was steep and the current strong, but there was no sign of a fall, no drag marks, no signs of a scuffle, no blood, no torn fabric. It was as if Daniel had simply stepped out of his truck and vanished. Investigators examined the scene and found no indication of theft or foul play. His wallet was later found at home. His pager remained inactive. His bank account untouched. There were no skid marks on the road, no broken glass, no footprints that led anywhere. Just that truck, humming quietly under the moonlight, like a ghost waiting for its owner to return. The older client Daniel claimed to be helping. Police tracked down the man days later. He hadn't spoken to Daniel in months. No appointment had been made. No truck had broken down. The community was stunned. A man like Daniel, who lived by the clock and by his word, wouldn't disappear without warning. As the hours turned to days and search crews expanded their radius, one question began to take root, deep in the minds of everyone who knew Daniel. If he wasn't heading to that job, where was he really going that night? Who was the last person to see Daniel, and why didn't he make it to the job that night? October 20th, 1997, 3 days after Daniel Reese disappeared, the search came to an end in the most devastating way possible. It was just after noon when a hiker named Luke Carrington, walking his dog along a remote bend of the Snake River, spotted something tangled in the brush near the river's edge. At first he thought it was a discarded tarp or pile of clothing caught in the reeds, but as he moved closer his dog froze and began to bark. That's when he saw it. Legs motionless, half submerged in muddy water and leaves. Emergency services responded within the hour. The body was carefully pulled from the bank and laid out beneath a tarp. Fully clothed. No defensive wounds. No gunshots. Just one darkened bruise at the base of the skull. The coroner confirmed it was Daniel Reese. His body showed no signs of drowning. The water had carried him only a short distance from where his truck was left. His watch was still on his wrist, cracked but working. His wallet was still in his back pocket, cash and ID untouched. Keys were clipped to his belt loop. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a mugging. It was something else entirely. The autopsy later revealed Daniel had died from a single deliberate blow to the back of the head, consistent with a blunt object like a tire iron or pipe. The angle of the wound suggested he never saw it coming. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on his arms. It was sudden, fast, efficient. As news spread, Garden City fell into a collective state of disbelief. Daniel, the kind-hearted mechanic everyone knew, had been murdered. And not in some dark alley in a distant city, but here, on their roads, in their woods. by someone who had walked the same streets, maybe even sat at the same diners. Emily Reese collapsed when she received the call. She'd held out hope, as irrational as it was, that her brother might still be out there, injured, hiding, even amnesiac. Anything but dead. Now the finality crushed her. Daniel's funeral was held that Friday. The chapel was packed. Co-workers, old school friends, customers who barely knew him but had stories of his kindness. One man stood outside for nearly an hour just to pay his respects, recalling how Daniel once fixed his brakes for free when he'd been between jobs. Pastor Thompson, who delivered the eulogy, said it best. Daniel was a man who lived for others. He helped without question, and now we're left asking why someone would do this. The case made local news, then regional. Headlines read, "Idaho mechanic found dead near riverbank," and "Murder mystery stuns quiet community." But behind the headlines were real people, grieving, afraid, and growing impatient for answers. Police were stunned by the lack of evidence. No blood was found in the truck. No fingerprints besides Daniel's. No shoe prints in the surrounding area. And no witnesses had seen or heard anything suspicious that night. The riverbank was remote, but someone had known where to strike and how to vanish. Rumors began to swirl. Was it someone from out of town? Someone Daniel had unknowingly angered? Or worse, someone he trusted? The fact that nothing had been taken only deepened the mystery. His wallet, his tools, even the truck itself, all left untouched. The motive wasn't money. It wasn't opportunity, which left one terrifying possibility. What motive could exist for killing someone like Daniel Reese? In the days following Daniel Reese's murder, the Boise County Sheriff's Department moved quickly. The small-town force, unaccustomed to homicide investigations, immediately called for assistance from nearby precincts. Detectives, patrol units, and crime scene analysts were pulled into the case. The goal was clear: find out who killed the town's most well-liked mechanic and why. They started with the basics. Interviews. Dozens of them. Everyone who had seen or spoken to Daniel in the week leading up to his disappearance was questioned. Co-workers described him as calm and focused, with no indication of stress. Emily shared what she remembered about the mysterious job Daniel said he had scheduled the night he vanished, a job that turned out to be a lie. That detail set off alarm bells. Investigators looked deeper. Had Daniel been lured out, tricked? Or was he keeping a secret no one knew about? Flyers were posted. Tip lines opened. Police canvassed nearby truck stops, rest areas, and motels. Then, one name emerged, a drifter known only as Kyle. He'd been spotted at a diner near Daniel's garage about a week before the murder, asking questions about the shop's hours and whether Daniel worked alone. He'd claimed to be looking for work. Staff remembered his odd, erratic behavior, but after the murder, Kyle vanished. No last name, no vehicle plates, no trace. The lead unraveled fast. With no surveillance cameras in place at the time, this was 1997, before digital systems were widely used in small towns. There was no footage to follow. Sketches were circulated based on witness descriptions, but nothing came of it. Then came another rumor. A former client of Daniel's, a man named Ron McKellar, had once accused him of overcharging for repairs. According to co-workers, McKellar had stormed out of the garage months earlier, shouting that he'd make things right. He was known for his temper. When questioned, McKellar admitted to the outburst but claimed he hadn't seen or spoken to Daniel since. He passed a polygraph. No evidence linked him to the scene. The investigation hit wall after wall. Police collected what they could from Daniel's truck in the riverbank. Fibers, hair samples, partial fingerprints, but nothing matched anyone in their database. The technology simply wasn't there yet to run complex comparisons or build genealogical profiles. At the time, DNA evidence was still limited in scope and reliability. With no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no solid suspect, speculation took over. Some believed Daniel had stopped to help a stranded motorist and been ambushed. Others thought it might have been a case of mistaken identity, a robbery that went wrong, or perhaps something far more personal, someone with a vendetta hidden beneath the surface. As days turned to weeks, the public grew restless. The media latched onto the story, dubbing Daniel Idaho's gentle mechanic. His photograph appeared nightly on local broadcasts. Community forums filled with theories, many of them wild and baseless. But behind the noise, One truth remained. Daniel was dead, and the person responsible had vanished like smoke. The sheriff's department faced increasing pressure to make an arrest, yet every lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Detectives began quietly wondering if the killer had local ties, or if someone had helped them disappear. Why did the one promising suspect disappear, and did someone help him vanish? By the time 1999 arrived, the investigation into Daniel Reese's murder had all but stalled. The thick stack of reports, evidence logs, and handwritten notes that once occupied a full table at the Boise County Sheriff's Department now sat collecting dust in a single beige file box. The word inactive was stamped across the front. 2 years earlier, the case had consumed Garden City. But now, as newer crimes emerged and fresh headlines stole the public's attention, Daniel's name slipped from daily conversation. For most people, life had to move forward. For his family, it couldn't. Emily Reese refused to let her brother become just another forgotten file in the archives. She was only 23 when he was killed, but grief aged her in quiet ways. She spent nights poring over copies of police reports, highlighting inconsistencies and scribbling notes in the margins. When local detectives began shifting focus to other cases, she pushed back. She called them weekly. She wrote letters to state officials, to the governor, even to television producers who covered unsolved crimes. Few replied. In 2001, she hired a private investigator named Richard Hanlon, a retired detective from Spokane with a reputation for solving the unsolvable. He retraced Daniel's final steps, reviewed crime scene photos, and interviewed the few remaining witnesses. His conclusion was grim. No new leads, no suspect to pursue. Still, he told Emily something that stuck with her. "Cases don't die," he said. "They just wait for the right moment to be seen again." Emily clung to that belief. When early internet forums began to grow, she created a simple website titled Justice for Daniel Reese. It was crude by modern standards, white text on a black background, a grainy photo of Daniel smiling beside his truck, but it served a purpose. It kept his name alive. Visitors could read about the case, submit tips, or share condolences. Within months, she was receiving messages from strangers around the country, retired detectives, amateur sleuths, and grieving families who saw their own loss reflected in hers. Every year, Emily organized a candlelight vigil by the Snake River, near where Daniel's truck had been found. Dozens attended in the early years. Fewer came as time went on, but she never missed one. "He deserves a voice," and she would say. Inside the sheriff's department, the case changed hands several times. Younger detectives inherited it, eager at first, then resigned to its limitations. Each believed they might find something overlooked, but the technology of the late 90s and early 2000s could only go so far. DNA samples were degraded, fingerprints were partial. The evidence wasn't gone, but it wasn't speaking. By 2005, most of the original investigators had retired or transferred. The new generation of officers barely recognized Daniel's name when it came up in old briefings. The once burning urgency had faded into a flicker of professional frustration. The phrase "cold case" became official, and yet Emily never stopped. She visited the station every year on the anniversary of Daniel's death, bringing coffee and thank you cards for the officers. It wasn't anger that drove her. It was love, a kind of stubborn faith that justice still lived somewhere beneath the surface waiting. Garden City moved on. New businesses replaced the old diners. The garage where Daniel worked was sold, renovated, and renamed. For most residents, the memory of the mechanic by the river had become a faint echo. But for Emily, it was as vivid as the day she lost him. Time, it seemed, could heal everything, except uncertainty. Would time bury the truth, or finally bring it into the light? It was early spring 2023 when Daniel Reese's case file was pulled from the archives. As part of a newly funded statewide initiative, the Idaho Cold Case Resolution Task Force, a small but determined unit composed of forensic experts, retired investigators, and data analysts, was tasked with reviewing unsolved murders stretching back decades. Each case would be evaluated for overlooked evidence, with special attention to biological material that could be tested using modern DNA techniques. Daniel's file was among the first reviewed. Detective Marissa Lane, one of the newest leads on the task force, opened the yellowed file labeled Reese, Daniel, 1997. Inside were photos from the crime scene, the coroner's report, and a small, unassuming plastic evidence bag containing what had once been dismissed. A single strand of hair, found clinging to the collar of Daniel's shirt. At the time, it had been labeled non-human, likely assumed to be pet fur or fiber. But with technology in 1997 far less sophisticated, the sample had never been definitively analyzed. Lane, trained in forensic biology, knew the value of even the smallest sample. She sent it to the state lab in Coeur d'Alene for mitochondrial DNA testing, a method capable of analyzing even degraded or contaminated biological material. 3 weeks later, the lab called back. The hair wasn't from a dog or cat. It wasn't a synthetic fiber. It was human. Specifically, a degraded fragment of mitochondrial DNA belonging to a male. Further testing, run through genetic genealogy databases, revealed a partial match. Not to a suspect, but to a relative, a second cousin once removed, living in Nevada. From there, analysts built out a family tree, mapping genetic lines that intersected across several Idaho counties. Eventually, one name stood out: Gerald "Red" Manley. He was a mechanic's assistant in the mid-1990s, working in the small town of Wilder, just 30 miles from Garden City. Gerald had never been listed in the original investigation. His name hadn't come up in interviews. No one had remembered him. He had worked for less than a year before moving on, quietly, unremarkably. But further digging revealed something strange. Gerald had been in Boise in October 1997. Records showed a paycheck issued from a scrapyard just 6 miles from where Daniel's truck was found. No one had ever connected him to Daniel Reese, or so they thought. When investigators pulled Gerald's old employment records and DMV photo, one detail jumped off the page. A customer from Daniel's garage had once described a red-haired guy who loitered in the parking lot in the week before Daniel's death. Back then, that tip went nowhere. But now, there was a face, a possible connection, and the DNA put Gerald Manley squarely in the vicinity of Daniel Reese's final moments. Detectives dug deeper. Gerald had lived under the radar for decades. No serious criminal record, a few bar fights, one dismissed assault charge in Montana in 1995. But nothing that had raised alarms. He had since moved to Caldwell, Idaho, just 40 minutes west of Boise, where he ran a small auto salvage business. As investigators prepared to approach him, the cold case team couldn't help but feel the weight of what they'd uncovered. One overlooked strand of hair, one fragment of degraded DNA, and suddenly, after 26 years of silence, Daniel Reese had a voice again. But even with a name and a match, one question loomed large. Could this silent thread of DNA lead to Daniel's killer, or spark a new mystery? April 12, 2024, began like any other day in the small working-class community of Caldwell, Idaho. But by late afternoon, flashing lights and unmarked vehicles converged on a modest home at the edge of town. It was there, in a weathered single-story house tucked behind a chain-link fence, that authorities arrested Gerald "Red" Manley, age 62, for the murder of Daniel Reese, a crime committed 26 years earlier. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as Manley was led out in handcuffs. Some had known him for years. To them, he was just Red, the quiet guy who owned a scrapyard off Route 19. He fixed up old cars, kept to himself, and occasionally bartered used parts with local mechanics. He'd never raised suspicions. No arrests, no violent outbursts. Just a man living a solitary, unremarkable life. But behind that calm exterior lay a secret he'd buried for over 2 decades. When detectives from the Idaho Cold Case Task Force arrived at his door that morning with a warrant, Manley didn't resist. He seemed resigned, almost expectant. Taken to a nearby holding facility, he sat in an interrogation room for hours before speaking. But when he did, the confession came quickly, quiet, emotionless, and chilling in its simplicity. He told investigators that in October 1997, he had crossed paths with Daniel Reese purely by chance. Manley's car had broken down on a back road near the Snake River. Seeing a pickup truck pull over, he waved it down. Daniel, ever the helpful mechanic, had stopped to assist. At some point during the exchange, an argument broke out. According to Manley, Daniel made a comment he didn't like, something about getting professional help. In a sudden burst of rage, Manley struck him from behind with a tire iron he kept in his trunk. Daniel collapsed instantly. Manley claimed he panicked. He dragged Daniel's body down to the riverbank, hoping the current would carry it away. Then he wiped the tire iron, returned it to his vehicle, and drove off into the night. There was no calculated plan, no long-standing grudge, just a flash of anger that ended a man's life. Detectives were left stunned. Not only had Gerald Manley never once been mentioned in the original investigation, but he'd managed to live an entirely new life, undetected for over 25 years. The only reason his name surfaced was due to the mitochondrial DNA fragment, evidence that in 1997 would have been impossible to trace. When news of the arrest broke, the Garden City community was shaken to its core. Residents who had long given up hope for closure were now grappling with a fresh wave of shock. Local headlines read, 1997 cold case solved, arrest made in Reese murder. Former co-workers and neighbors of Daniel Reese gave tearful interviews expressing relief and disbelief. "I never thought we'd see this day," said Emily Reese, Daniel's sister, at a press conference. All these years, and he was living just a short drive away. But the arrest raised new questions. Records revealed that Manley had once been arrested in Montana in 1995 for an assault case eerily similar in nature. Charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Could that case have been more than just an isolated incident? Had Daniel's murder been his only crime, or just the only one ever proven? Investigators began quietly re-examining Manley's past, reaching out to police departments in towns where he'd lived over the years. Because in solving one cold case, they may have uncovered the start of another. How had Gerald escaped justice for 26 years? And were there other victims? September 9th, 2024. Cameras gathered outside the Boise County Courthouse as the long-awaited trial of Gerald "Red" Manley began. It had been 26 years since Daniel Reese was murdered, and now the man responsible for his death sat in a courtroom, shackled and silent. The state had assembled a seasoned prosecution team, led by ADA Michelle Vega, who had specialized in cold case litigation for over a decade. Her mission was clear: to ensure that justice, long delayed, would not be denied. In her opening statement, Vega painted a clear picture. Daniel Reese was a man who lived with kindness, who gave without expecting. His only mistake was stopping to help the wrong person. She described the brutality of the act, how a single violent blow had ended Daniel's life, and how the killer had left him alone along the Snake River, like a discarded object. Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution presented evidence both old and new. The key, the DNA match from the strand of hair found on Daniel's collar. Though mitochondrial and not a direct nuclear match, it was strong enough, when coupled with genealogical tracking and the confession, to tie Manley to the crime. Vega also introduced Gerald's 1995 assault case in Montana, where he had reportedly attacked a fellow mechanic during a verbal dispute. Though that case never led to a conviction, the parallels were clear: unprovoked aggression, a blunt object, and a quick disappearance. Character witnesses for the prosecution included retired police officers, forensic experts, and Daniel's former co-workers. They recalled how Daniel always helped others without question, never hesitated to lend a hand, and lived a life that stood in stark contrast to the man accused of taking it. Then came the emotional climax of the trial: Emily Reese's testimony. Taking the stand, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a photo of her brother. Her voice cracked but never wavered as she spoke. "Daniel was the kindest soul I've ever known. He raised me after our parents died. He kept our little family together. All he ever wanted was to do right by people, and all he was trying to do that night was help." The courtroom fell silent. The defense, led by attorney Calvin Rourke, made no effort to deny the DNA or the confession. Instead, he argued diminished responsibility. He painted Gerald as a mentally unstable man, undiagnosed, untreated, and volatile. Rourke pointed to gaps in Manley's memory, claiming he barely remembered that night at all. He described a childhood of trauma and neglect, positioning Manley as a man who needed treatment, not punishment, but the jury remained unconvinced. After 6 days of deliberation on September 25, 2024, the verdict was read aloud: guilty of second-degree murder. Manley showed no visible reaction. Emily, seated in the gallery beside former detectives who had worked Daniel's case, let out a breath she had been holding for decades. Tears fell freely. She wasn't alone. Members of the community, some of whom had attended Daniel's vigil every year since 1997, embraced quietly. The sentencing phase would follow in October, but for many, the verdict itself carried a sense of long overdue closure. A man who had escaped justice for over 2 decades was finally held accountable. Still, one question hung in the air, unspoken but persistent. But beyond the verdict, what would justice truly mean for Daniel's legacy? Long after the trial of Gerald Manley ended, the story of Daniel Reese continued to echo through Idaho and far beyond. Daniel had never sought recognition in life. He was a quiet man, a mechanic who fixed things and helped people. But in death he became something more, a symbol of both the fragility of justice and the power of unwavering persistence. His name came to represent not just tragedy, but hope that even the coldest cases could be brought back into the light. In the months following the trial, Daniel's sister, Emily Reese, channeled her years of grief and advocacy into something larger. She launched the Justice for the Forgotten Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families of unsolved homicide victims. The project offered guidance on navigating the legal system, understanding DNA advancements, and advocating for renewed investigations. Through public speaking, training workshops, and partnerships with forensic labs, Emily ensured that Daniel's case would be the start of something much bigger than a single conviction. Her mission gained traction quickly. Families from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of loss and silence. Within its first year, the project helped initiate DNA retesting in over a dozen cold cases across the Northwest. Local news began referring to Emily as the woman who refused to let her brother be forgotten. But the impact wasn't limited to families. Moved by the case, Boise County authorities conducted a full audit of their evidence storage system. Decades-old boxes of unsolved cases were reevaluated, cataloged, and in many instances digitized for future re-examination. What began as a single murder case evolved into structural reform. In 2025, the state of Idaho passed legislation allocating dedicated funding for cold case units. These teams, now permanently staffed with forensic specialists and data analysts, began the slow but necessary process of breathing life into long dormant files. The Reese case had proven what was possible when persistence met technology, and lawmakers responded. Meanwhile, back in Garden City, something extraordinary happened. The old garage where Daniel had worked, the same place he'd spent his days tuning engines and rebuilding classic trucks, was purchased and restored by a coalition of local volunteers and small business owners. With Emily's blessing, it reopened as Daniel's Place, a community garage. The program offered free vehicle repairs to elderly residents and low-income families, staffed by a mix of professional mechanics and vocational students. Inside the waiting room, a photo of Daniel hangs framed beside a plaque that reads, "In memory of Daniel Reese, who gave more than he took and helped more than he had to." But perhaps the most powerful tribute happens every October 17. On the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, each year, a growing crowd gathers at the bend of the Snake River, where his truck was found all those years ago. Locals light candles. Emily reads names of others still waiting for justice. Families hold each other, many for the first time, united by grief, and by the belief that no story should end in silence. Daniel's case is no longer just a file. It's a movement. It's proof that one person's refusal to let go can change systems, inspire reform, and bring the forgotten back into the light. Yet one haunting truth remains. For every Daniel, there are dozens still waiting, dozens still missing, dozens still silenced when the system forgets. Who will fight to remember? After 26 long years, justice finally arrived for Daniel Reese. Not in the form of vengeance, but in the quiet closure of truth finally revealed. Daniel was never famous. He was an ordinary man living a humble life in Garden City, Idaho. But through the unwavering love of his sister and the persistence of those who refused to give up, his story became a symbol of resilience in the enduring pursuit of justice. The arrest and conviction of Gerald Manley brought long-awaited answers. But more than that, it ignited a much-needed conversation about the way cold cases are handled, how evidence is preserved, and how families are too often left in the dark, waiting for a phone call that never comes. Daniel's case became a catalyst for change, not only within Boise County but across the state of Idaho. His legacy lives on not just in memory, but in action. A scholarship for at-risk youth now bears his name. The garage he once worked in has been transformed into a community repair center, serving those in need. And every year, candles flicker beside the Snake River, a symbol of remembrance and hope for those still searching for answers. Daniel Reese may have been lost, but he was never forgotten. His story proves that even after decades of silence, the truth can still speak. And sometimes all it takes is one voice refusing to be quiet. If you believe in justice for the forgotten, don't let their stories fade. Share them, say their names, and keep the light on.